This lecture is on the topic of the Hebrew Bible and humanism. Now, what the Hebrew Bible is more or less known, although it must be said that it's one of those books which are frequently quoted but rarely read, except at certain occasions and only partially. However, the book is there, and you can read it. While the question what humanism is somewhat more complicated. And as you have seen from the program, I intend to devote this lecture to a discussion of what do we mean by humanism. And in this lecture it will also at least marginally appear what is a relationship to the Hebrew Bible. Now, first of all, let me say that the concept of humanism is used in different forms. I should like to distinguish between three, most of all. One is a concept which is limited to Renaissance humanism. And the definition of humanism in this narrow historical sense is that it is a return to classic antiquity, to literature, classic languages, especially Greek, classic art, and that it existed as a phenomenon, as a partial phenomenon of the Renaissance. This is a view which is, for instance, held by Professor Christeller, one of the great specialists in the field of Renaissance history. It is undoubtedly in its way a correct view. However, it is, it seems to me, too narrow a view because it does not sufficiently pay attention to the fact that there was humanism long before the Renaissance and humanism long after the Renaissance. The second definition, with which you are perhaps more familiar with, is one which you find, let us say, in such organizations or movements like the humanist society or various humanist movements in the world today. There one might define humanism as a movement of, I don't mean that in the strict sense, technical sense of the word, of ethical culture, a movement which emphasizes ethical values as being significant, but with the exclusion of theological or religious considerations or beliefs. It is a non-theistic ethical movement, and very often with a strong anti-religious emphasis, or as someone might say, bias. There again, of course, the name is perfectly legitimate for what the movement represents, but I would say, again, this concept of humanism does not do justice to the depth of the humanist philosophy as it has lasted for over 2,000 years in the world. Now, the concept which I am trying to talk about, or in which I use humanism here, is, you might say, a global philosophy about man. A global philosophy about man which, in spite of many differences, has had its continuity from the time of the Hebrew Bible in the Near East to the time of Buddhism, let us say, in the Far East, through Christianity, through Renaissance, through the Enlightenment movement, Enlightenment philosophy, through thinkers like Goethe and Marx, up to thinkers today, of which I would name perhaps Albert Schweitzer, Albert Einstein, and Bertrand Russell as the three most outstanding and most known representative of humanism as a global philosophy. Now, if I were to describe briefly what is this global philosophy of man, which humanism has offered in these 2,000 or 2,500 or 3,000 years almost, one would say briefly that both in its religious and its non-religious forms, because it has both, it represents the idea, in the first of all, of the unity of man, that humanity or the human race is not an abstraction, is not just a word, but is a reality. Secondly, of man's capacity to develop into ever higher stages, that he, if you put it this way, can become or that he ought to become, you might say what he can become, that he ought to develop that potential which is in him. Thirdly, the belief in man's dignity and freedom. And eventually, the idea of tolerance and peace and of reason and love as humanizing forces in mankind. This is an attempt to describe very briefly the general philosophy of humanism. And what I shall try now is to deal with each of these ideas more particularly and more specifically. I begin with the first idea, namely the unity of the human race, that there is only one man and that there is something like human nature, that there is something like the essence of human nature, something common to all men which is definable. I shall come back later on to this problem because it's a highly intricate problem, both philosophically and anthropologically, what this is, this thing, human nature. As you all know, we say it's human nature usually when we refer to something nasty and are in a kind of tolerant mood and say it's human nature. But the humanists were really concerned with this, not in that sense it's human nature, but in the sense of trying to define, to determine, to inquire what is this common to all men. The idea is here that all men share the same substance, that each man is all man, that in each man all of humanity is contained. Well, let me try to be more specific and to go over the tradition of that first idea of humanism, namely the unity of man, by quoting you a number of sources. I hope it will not too bothersome for you to listen to lots of quotes today in which I try to develop or to show you the continuity of the idea throughout 2,000 or 3,000 years in Western philosophy, in Western thought. And the only way of really doing it is, I think, or the best way, I think, is to quote, because otherwise things do not have the concreteness which they have as they have in the living word of great authors. Now let us begin with the Hebrew Bible. There, of course, as probably most of you know, the history of man does not begin with the history of a Hebrew or the history of any other nation, but only one man and one woman is created. There is no race which is at the beginning or no nation which is at the beginning. And it's very interesting how the Mishnah comments on this fact that there is only one man who is created first. And incidentally, I have to say, which I should have perhaps mentioned in the beginning, when I speak about the Hebrew Bible, I shall speak not only about the Hebrew Bible, but refer to the later development of Jewish thought, as it is found in the Talmud, or even sometimes as it is found later. Historically speaking, of course, I'm aware that not only the Bible is written is not a document written at one day, by a statement by which I do not mean to hurt anybody's religious feelings, and also that naturally the later development, 500 or 1,000 years later, is historically speaking something which came later. But then there is also a great deal of sense in the assumption that the Bible is one, and not only the Bible is one, but the Bible is one with the later tradition of the Jewish development. Because historically speaking, this is like a flower, like a seed which grows and flowers, or a flower which develops. It is a later stage, it's a fuller stage, and yet one can see a unity in the whole, which permits us to speak of all this as a whole, even though we know that historically speaking, there are many different sources and, in fact, also differences. Now, the comment of the Mishnah I'm referring to is a very interesting one. It is to be found at a place where you might not expect it. That is in criminal law. As you know, perhaps some of you know, the Talmudic criminal law was exceedingly careful not to punish somebody who might be innocent. Therefore, it required two witnesses who not only warned the wrongdoer before he committed the crime, but two witnesses also who saw him in the act of committing the crime. Well, that explains why a court in Jerusalem, who once in 70 years condemned the men to death, was called a bloody court. That in itself shows a great deal of reference, what Schweitzer would call reference for life, or respect for life, at a time when life was not always that respected. But when the witnesses came, these witnesses who claimed that they had seen the men commit the murder, let us say, the Mishnah says literally, one intimidated the witnesses. The court intimidated the witnesses. Well, if we hear that the court intimidates a witness, we all know what that means and we are kind of concerned. But the intimidation of the witnesses in the Talmudic court was quite different. The judge will tell the witness the following. Do you know why God has created first only one man? In order to show, first of all, that nobody can feel superior to anybody else and cannot say, my father was before your father. And secondly, in order to show that anyone who destroys one life is as if he destroyed all of mankind. And anyone who saves one life is as if he had saved all of mankind. Therefore, consider very well that if this accused is to die on your word, that this principle applies. Now, that is the later interpretation of this idea, and I would say it sounds to me like a perfectly logical interpretation, that the Hebrew Bible begins with the history of man as not being a history of tribes, races, religions, but truly the history of man. Now, in the Christian development, you find that the unity of man is expressed in the unity of Christ. And this has been expressed by the great Catholic humanist Nicholas de Cusa in a very simple and a very clear way. He says, the humanity of Christ becomes a bond of the world and the highest proof of its inner unity. This is the Christian interpretation of Christ as a man, as being the symbol of the unity of the human race. Now, from the Renaissance interpretation here, I jump rather quickly to the Enlightenment and quote you a few statements from the later centuries. First of all, I want to quote you a statement by Leibniz, which is very similar to the statement you find made by Nicholas de Cusa. Leibniz says, in our own being is contained a germ, a footprint, a symbol of the divine nature and its true image. And Ernst Cassirer wrote about this statement by Leibniz, saying that it means that only the highest development of all human energies, not their leveling, equalization, or extinction, leads to the truth of being in the highest harmony and to the most intense fullness of reality. Well, Cassirer's sentence might be a little difficult, especially if one just listens to it and does not read it oneself, but let me explain something here. Cassirer deals here with the problem of the universal and of the individual. That is to say, is there not, as many people have assumed, an opposition between fullest individuality and fullest universality? And today we live at a time in this 20th century of such equalization and leveling off of differences that many people have the idea that universality of mankind means sameness of all, leveling off of all differences. if everybody smokes the same cigarette and goes to the same movie and has the same taste, all standardized and prescribed by the big corporations, then we have really humanity in the flesh. But we don't. We have, in fact, humanity reduced to almost nothing. While it was the idea of Leibniz, of Goethe, also of Marx, whom I shall mention in detail a little bit later, that precisely the highest development of each of us, that brings out in ourselves the humanity which we share with everybody. Or if you put it in less technical language, the narrower a man is, the less human is he. The less he shares with all fellow men, the less he knows what it is to be human. The narrow man is nothing but himself, and that means nothing but that which is accidental in him. His anger, his resentment, his envy, his greed, and therefore he thinks and says that's human nature. But he's greatly mistaken. That is not human nature at all. That is precisely the accidental marginal element in him, because he has grown up with these parents or in this class under these circumstances. But he doesn't even know what human nature is. But if one fulfills himself, develops himself to the point of developing all his human forces, including, so I would say as a psychoanalyst, including also being in contact with that which is not conscious to most people, then he is in touch with all of humanity, because he is all. There is nothing in him, as Terence once said, nothing human could be alien to him. And then, of course, if you have reached that point, then you can love your enemy and you can love the stranger, because the enemy and the stranger are in you. There's nobody with whom you cannot feel that you share the same basic experience of living. This problem was already the problem which Leibniz considered. I mentioned briefly Spinoza, because Spinoza, who is the founder of modern dynamic psychology, of psychology as a science, you might say, he created the concept of a model of human nature. This model, he described, and that's why I called it model, is not you and me, but this is that which is nevertheless, like any scientific model, the essence of all of us. And he described in his ethics what are the laws which govern this model. And he showed the limitations, and he showed what is the possible freedom which this model has, this model of human nature. Let me now quote another philosopher, Hume, who wrote, "Mankind are so much the same in all times and places that history informs us of nothing new or strange in this particular. Its chief use, namely of history, is only to discover the constant and universal proofs of human nature." Let me now read something from a later philosopher, from the German Lessing. You all have heard of this Dritte Reich, the Third Reich, which was a term which Hitler used for his inhuman purposes. Now, actually, the term of the Third Reich was coined much earlier, many centuries before, by Joachim de Fiori. And it was meant by him to be the Reich which was, well, very similar, let us say, to what in the Jewish literature would be called the Messianic time. It happens that apparently maybe Goebbels or one of Hitler's men had studied at the university, so it had read about it and introduced this term, which was one of the most beautiful terms in the history of thought, to the evilness of Hitler's reality. Now, Lessing said, in this Third Reich, the conflict between man and man will be resolved by each person's awareness of his humanity. Now, this is very important, this statement of Lessing. Namely, conflicts can be solved really by each one's awareness of his humanity. That is to say, if I'm aware of my humanity, I'm aware of you. I'm aware of my enemy, so-called. And then there is no more conflict, because I am you. This is one of the central ideas in the history of humanist thought. Precisely that awareness of one's own humanity creates an understanding, a depth of understanding to the other, which makes it impossible for me to say, I'm good, I'm clean, I'm full of good intentions, and you are bad. It makes it impossible, that grotesque picture which we see in Cold Wars and Hot Wars, in which millions of people become paranoid because they are filled with a sense of their righteousness and with the evilness of their enemy, because they are afraid to see their own humanity. If they did, there would be no enemy in that sense, in that paranoid sense of one being essentially different from myself. And Lessing emphasized this idea very clearly, this awareness. I might say here, again referring to psychoanalysis, if one is really aware of one's own so-called unconscious, that it simply means one is aware of one's whole humanity. And then there is no stranger. Then one is aware that I'm a good person, but I'm a bad person, that I'm a murderer and I'm a little child and I'm an insane person also. All is in me. And therefore I don't project and say, you are evil and me is good. Well, this is all teaching of Christian or Jewish ethics, except that in psychoanalysis, Freud has elaborated a method by which one is able, for those who don't do it intuitively, to really experience all that which cuts them off from the awareness of humanity in themselves. Namely, that which they shove away and say, that does not exist in me, it just exists in you. Let me now quote a statement by Goethe, who has formulated the problem of humanism perhaps in the most, in this statement at least, in the simplest form. Goethe said, man carries within himself not only his individuality, but all of humanity with all its potentialities, although he can realize all these potentialities only in a limited way because of the external limitations of his individual existence. In other words, if man lived forever, all of his potentialities could be realized. But since we are thrown into this world without our will and knowledge at a certain accidental point and place, and we are taken away again, mostly against our will at a certain time and accidental place, this fact of our existence practically makes it impossible to develop all our potentialities. But that is a result of the peculiarity of human existence. It is, you might say, not that which belongs to humanists. Now, the next humanist I want to quote here is Marx. When I spoke about Marx, let us say 5 years ago, I had to, there was always a little shock that one should talk about Marx except by saying one is not a Marxist. It is very interesting that in the last 5 years, not only in the United States, but in most countries, with the exception of the Soviet Union, there has been a remarkable renaissance of Marx literature. Quite a number of books have been published in the last few years which give a picture of Marx as a thinker and Marx as a humanist, which Marx essentially was. Let me perhaps read you one, if you don't mind, one little lengthy sentence from the third volume of the Capital. That is really something Marx wrote toward the end of his life. In fact, he writes, the realm of freedom does not commence until the point is passed where labor under the compulsion of necessity and of external utility is required. In the very nature of things, it lies beyond the sphere of material production, namely the realm of freedom. In the very nature of things, it lies beyond the sphere of material production in the strict meaning of the term. Just as a savage must wrestle with nature in order to satisfy his wants, in order to maintain his life and reproduce it, so civilized man has to do it, and he must do it in all forms of society and under all possible modes of production. That is to say, even including automation in a tremendously enlarged sense, still, man cannot live entirely without working. With this development, the realm of natural necessity expands, because his wants increase. But at the same time, the forces of production increase, by which these wants are satisfied. Now, you have to consider, Marx really thought here of man's wants, the authentic wants. He did not yet think of the nationally advertised products which produce wants for things which he may not need. The freedom in this field cannot consist of anything else but of the fact that socialized man, the associated producers, regulate their interchange with nature rationally, bring it under their common control instead of being ruled by it as by some blind power. In other words, the freedom in the realm of production is the rational domination or control over the forces of nature with the purpose of producing that which man needs. They accomplish, these associated producers, their task with the least expenditure of energy and under conditions most adequate to their human nature and most worthy of it. Now you see here, for instance, how Marx, toward the end of his life, still uses the word human nature and speaks of a kind of work which is most adequate and most worthy of it, by which he also does not simply mean air-conditioned factory rooms and psychologists who interview the unfortunate people who have to accept it. But, he says, it always remains a realm of necessity. That is to say, that realm of material production. It always remains a realm of necessity, even if it is organized in a form most adequate to human nature. Beyond it begins that development of human power, which is its own end, the true realm of freedom, which, however, can flourish only upon that realm of necessity as its basis. Now, this is a typical humanist statement, which could have been made by Goethe, it could have been made by Lessing, it could have been made by many humanists before, namely that the realm of freedom begins where the development of human power is its own end, and where man does not serve any other end. Not only not the ends of a king, not only not the ends of the state, but not only the ends of production or even consumption, where the development of human powers is that which, for its own sake, is the essence of human freedom. I should like to say here that Marx had a difficult problem with this whole concept, and that's not only Marx, it's still a very difficult problem, with the whole concept of the essence of man, or human nature. If you speak of the essence of man, then you might easily be criticized, and rightly so, for taking an attitude which says there is a substance in man which is unchangeable, which is eternal, that there is really that historical change has no great meaning or significance. And then you come to a rather unhistorical concept of man. And then you would say, well, between the first beginnings of the human race, which had hardly emerged from the animal kingdom, to a man like Goethe or a man like Einstein or Schweitzer, there's always the same essence, looking at this like a substance which is eternally there. But on the other hand, if you deny that, if you say, no, there is no such thing as a nature of man or an essence of man, then you are easily caught in the position of complete relativism. Then you say, well, then what is common to man? Only their anatomy, only their physiology, only all their bodily processes. But otherwise, there's nothing which is common to man. There's nothing, psychologically speaking, which is common in the sense that it is that by the virtue of which he is man. Then, how could one man understand another? How could we understand Shakespeare? How could we understand primitive art? How could different races understand each other if there is not something which is common to man? Now, this is indeed a great difficulty to avoid the mistakes of both positions. On the one hand, to take an unhistorical concept of an essence, or on the other hand, to fall into what I would think an error of assuming a relativistic position in which there is nothing characteristic of man, nothing by which man could be defined. If you permit me, I would like to take a few minutes to give my own view on this, because it has a great deal to do with the whole problem of humanist philosophy. And I don't have the time to do that, but it has even a great deal to do with Hebrew and later Jewish thinking. And that is the following proposition, that the essence of man or the nature of man is not a substance, is not something which remains the same, but is a contradiction, is a conflict. The conflict being that man is at the same time within nature and he transcends nature. He is part of nature and he is not part of nature. With his body he is like any other animal, and yet he has a gift which no animal has, and that is of awareness of himself. He is not equipped with instinct like an animal. There is no built-in system which makes him act the way he has to act in order to survive. He is aware of himself, he is aware of his past, he is aware of his destiny, which is death. And that in this situation, man, you might call him a freak of nature, or you might call him the weakest of all animals, because he has all the burden of an animal body, and yet he has not the speed, not the strength, not any of the qualities which quite a few animals have in order to sustain their lives. And in this state, indeed, man would be utterly frightened, because he would feel utterly alone, utterly separated from his fellow man and from nature. And there is one way alone in which he can save his sanity, because this utter and complete aloneness, which you find, for instance, in the Old Testament described in the story of Cain, who is ostracized, is more than he could bear, as he says, and it's more than anybody can bear. It is actually identical with insanity. Man cannot tolerate this aloneness, and he has only one choice. Basic choice. He can either regress to nature, to where he comes from. That means he can try to eliminate that which makes him human. That is to say, his reason, his self-awareness. You find that for millions of years in primitive religion, in the form of either of identifying oneself with animals, of trying to be an animal, of drinking, of drugs, of sexual orgies, of all sorts of trances in which man tries to eliminate reason, and therefore that terrible thing which prevents him to feel harmony, in which makes him feel lonely. And then, strangely enough, at the same time, around between 1500 BC and 500, or beginning of the Christian era, man came across a new solution, namely that he could find harmony not by regressing, not by going back to nature, not by giving up his reason, but by the fullest development of all his human powers, and that means specifically of his power of love and reason. And that if he can develop this, if he can come to the degree of maturity in which love and reason in him are fully developed, that then again he finds harmony with men and harmony with nature. Not the pre-individualistic harmony which existed before he ever developed, but one which is built on the complete development of all his forces. This new goal of the full development of man in order to find harmony has had many names. The Chinese called it Tao, the road, the way. The Buddhists, Nirvana. The Hebrews, God. The Greeks, the unmoved mover. And later on, in non-religious terminology, other words were found for the same X, for the same goal, which is the harmony of man with the world, in which he does not feel frightened and not feel anxious, but one with the world. So I would suggest that in this problem of humanist thinking, namely that we must assume an essence of man, a nature of man, if we speak of humanism, that we might look for this essence and nature not in the goodness of man or the badness of man, but in that very contradiction within human existence which forces man constantly to proceed, to seek for new solutions, to find new harmonies, and a process which would only be completed in such a full development of man as it is symbolized in some religions as heavenly life, or as it is expressed in some others in the concept of the saint, or as it is expressed in humanist philosophy as a fully human man. I come now to the second concept of humanism, namely man's dignity. Let me give you here an example from the Talmudic development. Again, the Talmudic law said that workers have a right to strike even if they have received their wages already beforehand. Still they have a right to strike. And how does the Talmud explain this? He does it, as often in similar cases, by quoting the biblical scripture saying, where the biblical scripture said, God says, you are my servants. And the Talmud interprets this as meaning, that means you are not servants of servants. Man cannot be anybody's servant, any man's servant, as long as he's God's servant. That is the Talmudic interpretation, and that's why it means man not be compelled to work when he refuses to work, when he does not want to work. This is an infringement on his will. Well, this law is almost 2,000 years old, and it is still a law which is characteristic of all humanistic thinking. And that's why the right to strike is not only an economic measure and a political measure, it is at the same time one of the basic expressions of humanistic thinking. In Christianity, of course, you can easily see that the idea of the dignity of man is expressed in the very idea, in the very essence of this Christianity, that Christ was God and man. What could be a greater expression of the sense of the dignity of man? That Christ was God and man at the same time. But the theme of the dignity of man has really found in Christian thinking its most explicit expression in the Renaissance. Let us say in the 15th century, you find an author, Manetti, who wrote a book on the dignity and excellence, on human dignity and excellence. the concept of the dignity of man finds its strongest expression actually in Renaissance thinking. I'm quoting here one of the Renaissance philosophers of the 15th century, Manetti, who wrote a book on human dignity and excellence, in which the main thesis is that man is free, great, and dignified. And that about the same time, one of the most reactionary popes, Innocent, wrote a book on the misery of human life, in which he wrote, man is dirt, weak, and unstable. But perhaps never have the two opposing views of man's dignity as against the belief in man's weakness been so clearly expressed at the same time, and by people who belong to the same religion, in fact, as it was in the 15th century. Let me quote you from a document which is perhaps more familiar to you, from Piccola Mirandola's famous speech on human dignity, where he says, "Neither heavenly nor earthly, neither mortal nor immortal have we created thee, so that thou mightest be free according to thy own will and honor, to be thy own creator and builder. To thee alone we gave growth and development, depending on thy own free will. Thou bearest in thee the germs of universal life." Well, that's perhaps one of the classic expressions of Renaissance philosophy, humanism's belief in human dignity. And as you will notice in this quote, there's another element here, which then later on runs from Vico to modern philosophers like Marx, namely man as his own creator. Man makes his own history. Man is the one who creates himself in the process of history. Well, I already mentioned Schweitzer with his main ethical concept of reverence for life, which I think also falls into the category of the whole concept of the dignity of man, as in this concept of reverence for life. Now, let me talk about the third aspect of humanist thinking, and that is man's capacity for goodness. This is very important in humanist thinking. However, it does not mean, and has never meant in humanist thinking, that man is good. Humanists were not that naive, at least most of them were not, but that man has a capacity for goodness. Well, in the Old Testament, you see this already, might say in a negative way, if you read the story of the so-called, what is the Christian religion called the fall of Adam and Eve, you see there is no concept of sin in the original, in the Old Testament. In fact, the story is rather, God really, in the Old Testament, is afraid that if man, after having eaten from the tree of knowledge, would eat from the tree of life, he would live forever and be like God. And so he expels them. There's certainly no sin on the side of man there. And there's no mentioning of sin. This is all later interpretation from an entirely different viewpoint to call the act of disobedience a sin, and to assume that man, Adam and all his descendants, were corrupted by this original sin. It's interesting at this point perhaps to mention the root of the Hebrew word for sin, to sin, chata. That means to miss the road, to miss the aim. I understand that in contemporary Hebrew it is still used to miss the aim of when you shoot the center of the mark. And the word for repentance in Hebrew is teshuvah, which means return. In other words, you find here already in the language a concept which we might take up later, namely to sin is to miss the road, and to repent is to return to the right road, to the right goal. There is not the concept of, and that is very characteristic of the Jewish later tradition too, of the repentant, meek sinner. There is in fact a very interesting concept in the later Jewish tradition, which is expressed by the word Baal Teshuvah. That means, if we translate it literally and correctly, the master of return. And the Talmud says that where the master of return stands higher than those who never sinned. Now, if you compare the picture of the repentant sinner with the master of return, you see these are two very different concepts. The master of return is a master, and the act of return is an act of mastery. But return does not mean a cringing repentance or a self-accusation, but it means to drop what one has done and to do otherwise. Now, in Christianity, the concept of original sin, as you know, became the dominant one, even though Pelagius was thwarted, and even though in the Renaissance humanism, even among the Catholic humanists, while it was nobody dared to assail it directly, the tendency was to undermine its basic, let us say, to undermine the force of this dogma of original sin. You see perhaps nothing clearer than the fact that a man like Luther was not a humanist, in contrast to the Renaissance humanists, that he insisted on the evilness and sinfulness of man more than anyone else. That is precisely the difference between him and a man like the great Catholic theologians of the Renaissance who were humanists. He insisted on the sin, and he insisted on the peculiar act of repentance, which was the very opposite of what in the Hebrew tradition one would call a Baal Teshuvah. Now, later on in the development of the 17th and 18th and 19th century, you find more and more emphasis in the non-Catholic world on the freedom of man, in the sense that he is not bound by any inherent corruption. You might say that Enlightenment philosophy continues where Pelagius' thinking, if he had won, would have led Catholic thinking, namely to the belief that man is not inherently evil. The Enlightenment philosopher believed that by education, by social circumstances, man could be made good, that the evil in man was only due to circumstances. Well, if we today read the Enlightenment philosophers, we might think they were a little over-optimistic. They were not sufficiently aware of the depth and intensity of irrational strivings in man. They probably couldn't have imagined, even in their wildest thought, that there should be a century which was on the verge of creating the greatest good for all, and that the men in this same century should play with weapons of destruction which any day could and might very well destroy the human race. This degree of irrationality, this degree of madness, would have been indeed unthinkable for the Enlightenment philosophers. And if we call them naive for that, we might call them that. But I guess there are limitations to the imagination of the irrationality of man, which are specific for each culture, each generation. We might say that Marx shared this naivete of the Enlightenment philosophers and also did not see sufficiently the intensity of the potential evil in man. He was different as a humanist, and that's his main difference from the philosophers of the Renaissance and from most of the Enlightenment, in one sense, that he believed that preaching and education was not enough, but that man was conditioned by the practice of life, and this practice was conditioned by the structure of the economic system in which he lived. And therefore, in order to free, that was his idea, man from his exclusive material interests, you had to change the society which is organized according to satisfy and stimulate the greatest material interests. This was a materialism, so-called materialism of Marx, that his whole system had the aim of combating the materialism which is inherent in our industrial system. Now, I come to one other point which is characteristic for humanist thinking. That's the last point, namely the emphasis on tolerance, love of peace, and objectivity. Let me quote you one sentence from the Hebrew prophet, from Micah, or Micah, if you like, where he says, after a passage which speaks of eternal peace when men will destroy their weapons, and then he ends this picture, this vision, and says, "But they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid." And I leave out a few words. "For all people will walk every one in the name of his God, and we will walk in the name of the Lord, our God, forever and ever." So here his vision of the Messianic time is only one thing: nobody can make anybody afraid, and everybody has a right to pray to his God. There is not even the concept that his God, the gods of the Hebrew, will be recognized as the God of all the world. Well, it's actually only a consequence of this concept we find in this prophet when we look for the Talmudic solution to the question, what happens to the salvation of those who are not Jews? They are called in the Talmud the Tzadikei Umot HaOlam, the just men of the peoples of the world. What about their salvation? How are their souls saved? Have they to become Jews? Have they to pray to God? Have they even to recognize God in order to be saved? And interesting enough, the Talmud gives an answer which is very similar to that of Micah in a sense. Namely, that everybody who is not a Jew has the same share in salvation, provided he fulfills the 7 basic ethical laws which were already fulfilled by Noah at the time of Noah. That is to say, provided he fulfills the most elementary laws like he doesn't commit murder, he doesn't commit incest, he has some sort of a social system, and he is not an idol worshipper. But among these 7 Noachitic laws is not the command that he must worship God. Not to worship idols is enough. And I shall come back later on in these lectures to this problem of what it would mean if all of us, whether they are Christians or Jews or agnostics, could in fact say of themselves that they do not worship idols, and only afterwards discuss the question whether they worship God in what way. The Hebrew tradition has put a great emphasis on the non-worship of idols, and for reasons which I shall try to discuss later on in these lectures. But you see here the same spirit as the spirit of the prophet Micah, namely that nobody is forced to recognize or to believe in a God which may not be his, which he may not be accustomed to. What matters to him is no war and no fear. And that is, for him, the essence of religion. Well, you have then in the Jewish development a very interesting dichotomy, namely between 2 schools, one of which was always liberal and pacifist, or peace-minded, and the other one which was nationalistic and, let us say, not particularly liberal. The names which are attached to these 2 schools are the names of 2 great Talmudic teachers, Hillel and Shammai. Many of you know the story when a pagan came to Hillel and told him or to Shammai and told him he wanted to learn all the Torah as long as he could stand on one leg, Shammai threw him out of the room. And when he came to Hillel, Hillel said to him, well, don't do to others that which you don't want to be done to yourself. That's the essence. The rest is commentary. Now, this is the difference with the spirit of Hillel and Shammai. And it's very interesting how in the development of hundreds of years, which you see represented in the Talmud, actually there were these two wings of Pharisaic tradition, of Talmudic tradition, namely those who were liberals and not nationalists and for peace, the greatest being, as I said, Hillel and perhaps Rabbi Akiba on the one side, and on the other side, those who were nationalists, intolerant. If you are interested in this, I recommend to you a classic book, and that is by Professor Finkelstein, the volume The Pharisees, or rather 2 volumes, in which you see one of the most excellent, at least in my opinion, expositions and analyses of this difference between the right wing and the left wing in the Jewish tradition, or the humanist and the fanatic wing, if you use 2 other words. The Pharisees by Louis Finkelstein. I'm sorry, I don't know the publisher, but you can find it out at any bookstore, because it will be in the catalog. There's just a new edition, I think, which came out a few years ago. Well, what you find in Jewish humanism, you find in the same way in Renaissance humanism. The great Renaissance humanists like Erasmus, like Nicolas de Cusa, were concerned with religious tolerance. They saw the increasing religious fanaticism, which eventually led to that tragic event for the world, the 30 Years' War, to the religious wars of the 17th century, where all the fanaticism, all the paranoid suspicion and hatred broke out against fellow human beings for nothing more than that which today appears to most people, whether they are Catholics or Protestants or Jews or don't belong to any religion, like very trifling things. And yet about these things, a little change in the prayer book, a little change in the dogma. For these things, one accused each other and suspected each other quite sincerely of poisoning wells, of being possessed by the devil and God knows what. Now the great humanists try to stop that. They try to form a movement against this insane fanaticism, which went together with the flowering of humanism in the Renaissance. One of the great humanists, Postel, in the 16th century, wrote a book on global mutual understanding. That's the title. In which he demanded a simplified form of Christianity which would unify all religions and confessions and unify all men of goodwill. But as we all know, the humanists of the 16th century did not succeed to prevent the war. Those who read German, I want to recommend a book on this topic which is excellent by an Austrian Catholic historian, Friedrich Heer. H-E-E-R, Die dritte Kraft, the third force. He tries to describe the humanist anti-war group of the Renaissance, and it's an exceedingly valuable book. I hope one of these days it will be translated into English. Now today we find a new Renaissance of humanism, in all camps. We find it quite clearly in the Catholic religion, and nobody more than the late Pope John symbolized for the world the spirit of humanism, which always had been one Catholic tradition. Perhaps I might mention some conversations I had last year with some leading Jesuit theologians. And the question which I raised was this: what is your opinion about the salvation of a man who does not believe in God, but tries to do God's will. Now, tries to do God's will, defined not in terms that his intention is to do God's will, but in objective terms. To do God's will, let us say in the Christian sense, is to love one's neighbor, to do justice, to be charitable, not to hate, to be humble. What about the salvation of the man who does not believe in God, but does God's will or tries to do God's will? Well, these Jesuits with whom I talked all were of one opinion. There's no question about his salvation. And that actually raises another very interesting problem. It raises the problem of what is the importance of our conscious thought as against the inner reality. So you say you believe in God. So what? You say only words. One of these theologians, Father Rana in Innsbruck, makes a very interesting statement. It's old Catholic dogma that somebody who has been a practicing Catholic and who leaves the church has no salvation. That is a dogma which you cannot change if you are a Catholic. But in a fashion which is exactly the same method as the Talmud uses it, Rana asks some question. He says, well, how do you know anybody was a good Catholic? Maybe he only fulfilled these forms because they were forms. He had not his heart in it. He just did what he was supposed to do. How do you really know that deep in his heart he believed in God? And on the other, so you never know who was a Catholic. And on the other hand, you say now he has ceased to be a Catholic. How do you know that? Maybe he has gotten accustomed not to think in these terms anymore. But how do you know that deep in his heart he is not still a believer? Therefore, you do not know who was a Catholic, and you do not know who is a heretic now. So how can you say of anyone that he has no salvation? Well, I say this is a method which the Talmud uses very often, namely by reinterpreting a statement or a biblical verse, which in itself you cannot deny, nevertheless changing it because the meaning of not having salvation is completely denied if you make the interpretation which Rana gives here about this statement. Well, but you don't find only a renaissance of humanism today in Catholic circles. You find them also in Protestantism. Perhaps the greatest representative is a Protestant like Albert Schweitzer. You find them in non-religious circles. I would say that a man like Bertrand Russell is one of the great representatives of modern non-religious humanism. And you find them, interesting enough, today in the small socialist countries. That is a fact which is very little known in the United States, and that's why I mention it. You find, of course, in the Soviet ideology, among the many things which are mentioned, there's also mentioned quotes from Marx about humanity and so on, which sounds authentic if you just read the words. But actually there are ritualistic formulae which are used, but there's no reality behind it. Just as there is not much reality behind many of the religious statements we make on our side about God and our living under the law of God and whatnot. But you find that in Poland, in Yugoslavia, in Hungary today, and in Czechoslovakia. There is a movement of young philosophers, and some are not so young, but many of them are young, by which I mean 30 to 40, who are really humanists, who don't present a ritual or formula, but who really believe in the humanist nature of Marx socialism, and for that reason do not believe in the socialist character of Soviet socialism, because the two things have nothing to do with each other. There you find people with faith, with hope, and with a deep humanist conviction, and as far as I can see, and I have met quite a few of them, not only with a conviction, but with something in their personalities which represents humanism. Complete lack of fanaticism, great objectivity, and great humility. These people have gone through almost everything one can go through. They have gone through Nazi domination, they have gone through Stalinist domination, and they have come out not as cynics and not even as existentialists, but they have come out as people believing in man, but as people who are free from ideology. That is to say, for whom words are not realities, but who like to find and do find the essence of humanism in the philosophy of Marx. That, in my opinion, is a very encouraging development. There are some, of course, in the West who think likewise, but after all, it is encouraging to see that in these small countries there are not just only a few people, but there is a movement of intellectuals which is very, very different from the much advertised existentialist movement in France. They do not advertise, and that's also part of their humanism. Let me perhaps end now with one statement, and that is, humanism on the whole has risen as a reaction to a threat to humanity. Renaissance humanism could be considered a reaction to the threat to humanity by religious fanaticism. Enlightenment humanism could be considered as a reaction to the threat of humanity by nationalistic fanaticism. And today's humanism, whether it's Catholic or Protestant or non-religious or Marxist socialists, has arisen to a double threat to humanity, namely to the threat of physical extinction by nuclear weapons, and to another threat to humanity, a threat which men like Goethe already began to see, and certainly Marx, namely the automatization of man, that man is transformed more and more into a thing. I have read about the Lincoln at the World's Fair. I guess that is a symbol of the future. The man who speaks and smiles, what some machine puts into him, and you don't know anymore what is human and what is mechanical. This is indeed a threat to humanity which is connected with our industrial age, with the transformation of everything into things, with the utter and unrestricted materialism which characterize our age in the so-called free countries as well as in the Soviet Union. I don't see any difference in this respect. They are both equally materialistic, except Soviet Union is much more reactionary still than some of the so-called free countries are. Some of the free countries are indeed just as terroristic as Stalin used to be. Now, I think one can see today that in various parts of the world, because that's not only restricted to Europe, in various schools and political and religious movements, humanism experiences a renaissance. You can speak today really of a renaissance of humanism, and you can know why this renaissance has arisen. Namely, it has arisen for the very same reason of a concern with the fate of man and a threat which, unfortunately, is not conscious to many. This is actually the reason why I wanted to give you today a picture of the nature of this philosophy of humanism about man, and why I wanted to connect it in the following 4 lectures with the Hebrew Bible, because the Hebrew Bible is one of the greatest, as I see it, documents of humanism. Not the only one, fortunately, but one of the great documents of humanism, and it is by no means an idyllic and tranquilizing document. It is partly fierce in its cruelty, if you read the conquest of Canaan by the Hebrews, but it is mostly not characterized by cruelty, but by tremendously new sense of what humanity is. And that I shall begin to talk about in the next lecture in terms of the specific ideas of the Old Testament. Thank you. I am asked to tell you that there will be cards which will be which you can get for questions, because we'll now have about between 5 and 10 minutes intermission, and then we'll have an answering period until 10:30, provided there are enough questions. But I ask you to write your question on the cards which the ushers will give you. Well, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. I was trying to read most of the questions I got, but the time is too short to read them all. So I just begin with some. Here's a question. How does the irrational part of man fit into the unity of man? How does the irrational part of man fit into the unity of man? Well, my answer to that would be precisely because the irrational part of man is part of all men too. That is to say, if indeed there were some people who were free from all irrationality and others who were the irrational ones by nature or by essence, then indeed we would deal with two races or two different types of men. But we all are, as I tried to say in the lecture, we all are at the same time rational, irrational, good and evil. What constitutes the unity of man is precisely our awareness that all this is human, and hence that we cannot turn away from or against another man by calling him evil. Eichmann was not only the man who was executed in Jerusalem. He is in all of us. We all are Eichmanns for every minute in which we have turned away our heart from those who suffer, and we all do it. And we do it many times. It's a difference perhaps of quantity, but we have no reason, as I see it, to think, as Dr. Buber expressed it, that he cannot feel sympathy with Eichmann, although he was against the execution, because he doesn't feel anything of Eichmann is in him. I do not feel that way, and I think humanists in general do not feel that way. And that's why one can understand the evil in others if one begins to see it in oneself, and the irrationality in others if one begins to see it in oneself. That is exactly what humanism means. To what extent does the avenging Lord who destroyed the earth with a flood and who punished the Jews in the desert for 40 years represent anti-humanism? Well, I shall answer this question. I don't know whether I shall answer it, but I'll try to deal with it in a later lecture, where I talk about the concept of God and the concept of punishment. So, excuse me for not taking it up now. Here's a question. In view of the known facts that Marx was an anti-Semite and more dictatorial than Lenin and Stalin, how can you call Marx a humanist? Well, I guess do not want to embarrass the man who asked this question, or the lady. I don't know from what you assume that Marx was an anti-Semite. Perhaps only from the advertising which used to appear in the New York Times, and I guess in other papers, in which a reprint of a work of Marx, which was given the title by the publisher, "The World Without Jews," was advertised, and where it was said that Marx was the root of Stalinist and Hitler's anti-Semitism. Well, in the first place, this work of Marx never had this title. It's called by Marx On the Jewish Question. In the second place, it's by no means anti-Semitic. Marx was an internationalist, and so he would criticize the Germans and the Jews and the Russians. If he disliked any people, it was the Russians, actually. And that's why the one book or paper of Marx against the Russians is never been published, never been translated even into Russian. But you know who the greatest anti-Semites were in history? The Hebrew prophets. There is nobody who has said more critical, more damning things about the Jews than the Hebrew prophets. And if Marx is an anti-Semite, he was as much an anti-Semite as the great Hebrew prophets, except that the Jewish question to him was not in the center of his attention. But this whole assumption that Marx was an anti-Semite is actually completely erroneous and untenable fiction. The translation itself contains many errors, not only the title, and many omissions. It's one of the most brilliant writings of Marx on the question that man must not only be emancipated politically, but he must emancipate it humanly. If you have a chance to read it, you will enjoy it very much. Actually, you don't have to read it in this strange edition. There will soon be published a collection of Marx's early writings translated by Thomas Bottomore, professor at the London School of Economics. And in this second volume, which will be published, there is also on the Jewish question of Marx, and that's a correct translation. I'm awfully sorry at the moment. I do not remember yes, I think it's McGraw-Hill. I wrote a foreword to both editions, and I should know the publisher, but I think it is McGraw-Hill, and I can only recommend those who are interested in Marx's writings and not in falsifications to read these two editions. Here's a question: how can the ideals of humanism be reconciled with the existence of various religious traditions, if the traditions assume themselves each to be best? Well, you see, that is indeed a question, a very relevant question. Does religion itself not lead to a lack of humanism by its own claim that it is the only truth? Now, religions have, in the first place, reacted to that in different ways. Let us say you find in the history of Hinduism and of Buddhism a great tolerance towards other religions. You find at the same time that in the history of the Catholic religion, there were groups who were utterly intolerant and fanatical, and other groups in the Renaissance as well as now, and I mentioned men like Rana or Daniel Lu and others who are not intolerant at all. If you can say, whether you are a Jew or Catholic, that the salvation of man is not dependent on believing in God as you see it in your religion or another sees it in another religion, then indeed you do not have the problem necessarily that religion becomes transformed into an anti-humanist system. There is, however, this danger, and that's a reason for some people, like for myself, not to belong to any religion, except the fact that I have been born as a Jew and love the Bible and the Jewish tradition. But I personally have no part in any religious practice, much as I regret it sometimes, because I feel, to me, this danger of dividing men is of considerable importance. But nevertheless, I think you find in the religious tradition a great deal of religious tradition where the acknowledgement of one's own religious system or God does not necessarily create the feeling of humanity being divided. Here's a question: how can work remain fulfilling when society becomes fully automated? How does humanism effectively combat alienation? Well, that, of course, is one of the most crucial questions of our day. We live really in a very peculiar world, in many ways. The so-called underdeveloped nations have not yet the rudiments of modern industrial systems. And we here in the West, especially the United States, but the same holds true for Europe and for some slightly less advanced countries like for Germany especially, and for some less advanced countries like Great Britain, you have already a system where you can see that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, human work will be hardly used. But the hardly is important. There will still be, the machines have to be made by somebody. They have to be directed by somebody and watched by somebody. So let us assume there will be a 5 hours a week or 10 hours a week, a work week. Now that is really terrible. Because actually, so far as it seems to me, man has been a burden of prey or a burden of work, and in many ways an animal which was taken up by the need to work and to feed himself, his wife and his children. And that solved most of his problems. As long as you have to feed yourself, your wife and your children, you don't think too much. And you believe most things which are comforting. But what happens if you have that much free time on your hands? Then the religious problem really becomes a real problem. Because then you cannot escape. You can't sit in the television set for that much time. You let your children do it. You can't look at these movies for 12 hours a day. You would go crazy. You really are then confronted, for the first time in the history of man, the liberation from hard work confronts man for the first time with a spiritual problem. What is the meaning of living? Which man so far has escaped by making many children and producing many things. So he didn't have to take the question of what it meant to live was not too acute. He could forget about it because he was too busy. Of course, still we live in a peculiar realm of in-between because we are still busy. So we work 40 hours, 35 hours. And so there is only a few hours, so we go to the movie and kill another day. But actually, if people didn't have to work for themselves and for their children, that would be a hard thing for most of us. Because then they would have to ask themselves, what are we here for? What are we living for? Is there any aim? Is there any goal? What do we do? Well, maybe getting drunk is an answer, but it's not a very good one. What I'm saying is that the real problem of humanism, that is to say, the real problem of full development of man, will only begin with automation, will only begin and face man fully when he is forced to take life as a serious business and not a means of producing something. Here's a question which says, you speak of humanism as the key to man's harmony with the world. Can this humanism be taught to one who does not already feel it? Well, all I can say is that not true of many things? Can you teach music to somebody who hasn't a musical feeling? Can you teach painting to somebody who has not a sense of art? What can you teach which really is completely foreign to the person? I think the two things of teaching on the one hand and of having the thing already on the other are not two opposite poles. Besides that, certainly humanism you don't teach with lectures, and not by mine either. You teach it only by example, by being. Therefore, there would be not much use to teach children humanism. Perhaps I could tell you a Hasidic story, which is also a humanist story, where an adherent, a pupil of a famous Hasidic Rebbe, was asked, why do you go to visit your teacher? Do you go there to hear his words of wisdom? And he says, no, I go just to see how he ties his shoelaces. In the act of tying his shoelaces, there is the essence, there is a substance of the man, not in what he says. Now, of course, we are people, since we have this unfortunate literacy rate, who always are impressed by words, especially if they are printed or voiced from some platform, even more important than this one here. Then we're impressed by words. If you really want to know a man, you look how he walks, how he eats, how his hands move, how he smiles, what makes him happy and what makes him cry, and you don't pay too much attention to what he says. Anybody can say anything. It's very easy. And that holds true of humanism too. I had a Talmudic teacher when I was about 18, 19. He happens to be a great uncle of mine, and I was very fond of him, and I knew he was fond of me. And I was probably a rather vain and ambitious little boy. And one day I asked him, "Uncle, what do you think will become of me?" And he smiled very friendly and said, "An old Jew." Well, that is humanistic teaching. Well, I'm trying to find those which I can read easily, and at the same time, which I think I can not answer easily, but at least make best use of in the few minutes we have left. In humanism, man must feel himself a representative of all men. However, do all men have the capacity for this feeling? Well, the question here is, what does capacity mean? Does it mean they necessarily have this feeling? Or could they have it under certain conditions? Well, that depends on many factors. Perhaps I could mention here another humanist element, although that really belongs to a later spot in this series of lectures of the Jewish tradition, namely that on the Day of Atonement, the confession of sins is not that I have sinned, I have done this, but we have done, and all sins are mentioned. In other words, it's an experience that we all are sinners, and nobody is exempted. Well, whether a man has a capacity to do this, that depends on many factors. If you mean by capacity, the potential, the possibility, I would say yes, but many have lost it. Why is another problem. Here's a question which really refers to a philosophical problem, which I have not been dealing with, but I read it anyway. As you know, Sartre claims existentialism is humanism. Do you believe humanism and existentialism are mutually exclusive? To answer this question really would mean going into the discussion of Sartre's philosophy. And as I indicated, I think sometime before, there has been a lot of propaganda has been made for Sartre's philosophy as a philosophy of this century, as a philosophy of the future, and so on. I personally believe that Sartre's philosophy is in many ways the most an expression of the despair and of the egotism of the bourgeois world of the 20th century, in spite of the attempt to present it as a Marxist philosophy. Now, whether it's humanism, well, that's a matter of opinion. In certain ways, certainly it is. I personally feel that the whole idea of saying that man has a choice, is free to make his project at every time, is somewhat inhuman because it does not show the compassion I would think a humanist should have with all the factors which determine and limit a man in his freedom of decision. But still, I would say certainly it is, in a broad sense, a humanist philosophy, but I think it is a branch of humanism which is somewhat outside of, in many ways, of that main line of humanism which I have been trying to show here, and it is very different from Marxist humanism. This claim, I think, is not tenable. How do we learn to love and understand the nationalist and reactionary? Well, I must admit it's kind of hard, especially in the days when the nationalist and reactionary, most likely, if he comes to power, will give the orders of which will start a nuclear war, or maybe not give the orders to start it, but make a policy which will start it one way or another. It's awfully difficult to feel loving toward people who are out of, not even out of viciousness, but out of sheer lack of imagination, playing around with these things as if they were gadgets for toys for children. Nevertheless, I would still say one question. Ask yourself, each one, as I ask myself, how much of a nationalist you are. That is to say, where your own race, nation, family is involved, whether you have the same criterion, the same set of values, the same feelings which you have toward anyone else who is not connected with you by any bond of the past, of blood. It's, in other words, again, from a humanist standpoint, I would say we all are nationalists, and we all share one thing, and that is we are living in a time when millions of people are suffering, and we still have a good appetite. Now that is perfectly human. I do it too. I have a good appetite. I'm not accusing anybody. But I would say, as long as we are aware of that, we have no reason to sit in judgment over other people who might be a little worse than we are. Would you make a few more comments on Martin Luther? I got the impression you were not in complete agreement with his philosophy. Well, that is an understatement. And I find it even harder to love Martin Luther than some of our reactionaries and presidential candidates, or possible presidential candidates. He was indeed, as I see it, a man filled with a deep sense of the evilness in man, for whom salvation was complete surrender, and who showed a cruelty in his attitude toward the revolutionary peasants, which is unmatched by any reactionary, or rather it is matched by some, but certainly it's not, it isn't less than the worst we have seen. One of his last acts before his death was to move one of the dukes, I forgot who it was, to expel the Jews from his country. Well, that is only, I do not judge the world according to who is anti-Semitic and who isn't. And I cannot share the certain nationalistic feelings the Jews have, for instance, against President Nasser. So I'm not mentioning this because anti-Semitism for me is the crucial thing, but I do mention it because it is symbolic for Luther's hate. What chance do you see for a revival of humanism in the United States? What forms does it take, if it exists in the U.S.? Who are its representatives? Well, it certainly isn't the majority in either of the Republican or Democratic Party. I think the number of humanists in the United States is still small, but it is not that small and has been growing. I think there's a growing interest. I said that in my lecture. A growing response to the problems of humanism in the United States. Take, for instance, the fact that a man like Albert Schweitzer today is still probably one of the most admired men in the United States, even by people who hardly know anything about it, because he's a symbol of a man who practiced Christianity, who practiced humanism, in spite of many calumnies which have been spread about his work and so on, which I do not have to go into now. I would think that many of those who fight for peace, who fight against atomic armament, many of those are humanists. Some of them are fanatics, just of another kind. I think you can see today in the United States that there is a wide front of people who are concerned with at least the survival of mankind, and I apologize for having said at least, because I guess at the moment this is the most we can hope for. And I would say there's a great deal of humanist feeling in that. You can see today that some of the fanaticism has been taken out of the anti-communist feeling. Of course, Mr. Khrushchev has helped a great deal, even lately, by saying that goulash is better than a revolution. And that is not precisely a statement Marx would have made. nor any other revolutionary. But I do not mean to support the Chinese position at the moment, so I better stop at this. Here's the question: if man has dignity, then how can this dignity be reconciled with charity? Which is another principle of Hebrew or Christian thought. Well, why shouldn't it? Dignity isn't pride. Dignity is actually nothing but, let me put it this way, not being for sale. The first time I was impressed by that was in Haiti, when I saw many years ago the Haitian peasants walking. Well, they are rather spectacular in their attitude. I guess some of you have seen them with this tremendous dignity in their attitude, in their way of walking, the way they hold their heads. There's no pride, just dignity. But then I saw Mexican peasants and other peasants, and I have also found that they have a great deal of more dignity than I find at home. And then I asked myself, how is that? And then I simply came to the result one day that the answer is very simple. These people are not for sale. That is to say, they don't smile and say words which help them to get ahead in business or anywhere else. I think it might be said, sadly enough, that in our world most of us are for sale, some more, some less. But every smile which is not felt and which is not meant is a violation of your dignity. And that has nothing to do with pride. And therefore, I think there's no conflict whatsoever between charity and dignity, but there is a conflict between charity and pride. Well, I'm afraid it is time to stop, so thank you.